Welcome back. We're following fast-moving events in Ukraine as we speak. A concerted effort is underway to find a solution. Joining me now is Roman Popadiuk. He is a former United States ambassador to Ukraine. Also with us, former United States ambassador to Georgia, William Courtney. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you to the show.
Delighted to be here.
Well, we have an agreement on the table right now, that agreement coming out of Geneva. Ambassador Popadiuk, let me start with you. Is this a triumph of diplomacy?
Well, anytime people are talking and are able to reach agreement through talking, that's a triumph. It's better that than any kind of conflict at all. We've seen all the preliminary reports regarding the agreement. There are two parts to the agreement as I see it. Number one is the issue of dealing with what's on the ground right now in eastern Ukraine. In other words, the individuals that are armed, giving up their arms, giving back the buildings to the government control, disbanding the demonstrators and giving amnesty to the demonstrators, OSCE monitoring, et cetera, and some other points in there. The second part is the issue of constitutional reform in Ukraine. And that's going to be the difficult part to implement, because I'm sure there'll be a difference in opinion in terms of how the Ukrainians see constitutional reform as to how the Russians may see constitutional reform.
Ambassador Courtney, as Ambassador Popadiuk pointed out, we have a diplomatic agreement, but the situation on the ground may be very difficult. Is that the challenge, getting people on the ground to buy this agreement as well?
There could be a challenge. It depends on what instructions Moscow gives to the militants and security forces they have in Ukraine. For example, in the past, Moscow has not always been so faithful in fulfilling international agreements. For example, the agreement that was just reached in Geneva calls on all sides to refrain from violence. Well, that means the Ukrainians are not even allowed to use force to expel the Russian security forces who are occupying buildings in some of the cities in eastern Ukraine. At some point, if those people don't evacuate those buildings, those illegal formations don't evacuate the buildings, the Ukrainian government has a responsibility to take some kind of action.
Well, at this stage, we're short on details on this agreement, but does it, Ambassador Popadiuk, take off the immediate threat of further sanctions from Moscow?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's quite clear that the EU, as well as the United States, were moving in the direction of further sanctions, given the buildup of Russian forces and Russian instigation of events in eastern Ukraine, that both the U.S. and the EU, as I was saying, were moving toward implementing greater sanctions. But right now, that is probably off the table, because there's going to be an opportunity to give this agreement time to flesh itself out and see if it can be put to actual use and implemented.
Ambassador Courtney, I want to ask you this because I've asked our other guests this as well. Do you believe that in reaching this agreement, Moscow was acting under pressure of further sanctions, and under pressure that it could be further isolated?
Yes, NATO yesterday announced that it was going to move more forces eastward, both exercises and perhaps potential deployments on the ground in the eastern members of NATO. That's Moscow's worst nightmare. That's the last thing Moscow would have wanted to come out of the crisis.
But are you suggesting here that this could escalate to the point of a military confrontation?
No, what I'm saying is that the last thing Moscow wanted was to have NATO even closer to its borders. So Russia has a problem now with capital flight, economic decline. The only issue now is how far the economy is going to decline this year, plus NATO coming closer to its borders. So on both of those grounds, this has been a failure for Russia. And then thirdly, of course, the international opprobrium that Russia has earned because of its activities.
Ambassador Popadiuk, that is exactly one of the arguments that has been made on the side of the Russians on why they took this action in Ukraine. The fact that NATO was expanding eastwards, there was a possibility. There is an agreement with Ukraine, but Ukraine is not a full member of NATO. But that was the point at which Vladimir Putin said, well, enough's enough. I'm drawing the red line here, and there'll be no more Western influence in essentially what is my sphere of interest.
I understand the points of your argument, but I don't think you can take it that way. I think you have to look at it from the perspective that Putin put on the table. I think Putin was in a phase where he wanted to bring back the old Soviet or Russian empire, and he's been quite clear about that in his own comments, bringing back the glory of Russia. So irrespective of the moves of NATO itself, and as Bill had just mentioned, I think Putin was moving in that direction. I think Putin's greatest concern was that Ukraine would be moving toward the West, and he wanted to take actions that would prevent Ukraine from moving toward the West, both toward NATO as well as the EU, and that's why we're at the stage that we are right now.
There is a perception, Ambassador Courtney, that Ukraine was asked to choose between Russia and the West. Was that a mistake?
It was not a mistake from the standpoint of the West. The West had clear standards, particularly the European Union and NATO, clear standards as to what would be required in terms of democracy and economic prosperity for Ukraine to come closer to the West. Ukraine was not close to meeting the standards for either one. Most Ukrainians wanted to go in that direction, but they still had a long distance to go. Moscow wanted to force a choice, but Ukrainians did not want to force a choice.
Because as one of the guests in our previous segment said, Moscow called for a meeting with the European Union, with Ukraine for November of last year, and Brussels, the European Union that is, said no meeting. So that was perceived in Moscow as basically the European Union saying, Ukraine's with us or there's nothing else.
Well, the economic dimension of what Moscow wants, the Eurasian Customs Union, it wants Ukraine in that. If Ukraine were to go into the Eurasian Customs Union, by definition, Ukraine would have to live with the external tariff wall of the Customs Union. That would have meant that it could not be part of the European Union, even under an association agreement. So just from economic realities, Ukraine did have to make a choice in that direction. And clearly the popular sentiment in Ukraine, even in much of eastern Ukraine, was to go toward Europe.
Ambassador Popadiuk, there was an argument made by Stephen Hadley, the former national security advisor in the Bush administration, that one of the motivations behind Vladimir Putin doing what he did in Ukraine was to leave the country in a constant state of tension, to leave it in turmoil, to create divisions there so that in future it could never become a member of the European Union or NATO for that matter.
Oh, I think Stephen had a very valid point. I think what Putin was trying to do, what the Russians were trying to do, is obviously destabilize Ukraine to such an extent that there are two goals here. And goal number one is to so neutralize Ukraine that Ukraine cannot move in either direction by creating a base in eastern Ukraine that would be supportive of Russia. In other words, if you had a strong eastern Ukrainian situation that supported the Russian view, Kyiv cannot make any decisions counter to what the people in eastern Ukraine want, and Russia therefore would have the threat of using eastern Ukraine as breaking off in the future against use it as a threat against Kyiv. I think one of the misunderstandings and one of the failures that came about for the Russian goal is there was a misunderstanding of the popular support for the type of policy that Putin was pursuing. If you look at all the polling in eastern Ukraine, the majority of people, including the ethnic Russians, support being within Ukraine, support moving toward Europe, and were against any kind of invasion by the Russians. I think this is one of the factors that led Putin to latch onto this agreement right now, because he's trying to get some victory out of a defeat. He didn't get that popular uprising in eastern Ukraine. The only way he got it was introducing his own special forces to instigate rebellions throughout Ukraine. And that's, so this agreement itself is to a certain extent Putin's victory, but also a loss for him in terms of what he had been actually trying to achieve in eastern Ukraine.
Ambassador Courtney, this also calls into question something that we've been hearing about more and more, and that is the so-called spheres of interest that major powers or regional powers have around the world, that they would like to have control in their neighborhood, etc., and that in this instance, Ukraine was in the sphere of interest of Russia, and it didn't want to let go.
Russia has continued to live with 17th, 18th, 19th century balance of power concepts, including sphere of interest. America earlier had that with the Monroe Doctrine. We've long since given that idea up. America wanted to keep Europe out of Latin America in those days. After the Soviet Union collapsed 2 decades ago, the West tried to convince Moscow that Russia would be better off having stable, prosperous neighbors, cooperative neighbors. Instead, the strategic outlook in Russia was more dominated by what Russians call the correlation of forces. And so they believed that keeping neighbors off balance, unstable, would enhance Russia's role in the neighborhood. In fact, it's diminished the role and it's alienated others. So to take Ukraine right now, not since Taras Shevchenko, a famous Ukrainian poet in the 19th century, not since Taras Shevchenko has anyone united Ukrainians as much as Vladimir Putin has by alienating them from Russia. And that's not the goal that most Russians would want.
Good. Ambassador Popadiuk, when we look at this agreement that's just been reached in Geneva, I mean, you look at the points here, all sides refraining from violence, illegal groups got to be disarmed, amnesty being granted to protesters, a bigger role for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, etc. That's all good and fine, but what happens next? What needs to happen in Ukraine to stabilize the situation so that we see a long-term pathway to peace in the country?
Well, I think we have to go back to something that Bill had mentioned earlier. We need to make sure that the Russians convey that message to the forces that they've been supporting in eastern Ukraine. That's the first thing. I think it's also important for the Ukrainian military as well as the Ukrainian security apparatus to be able to put in place the agreement. In other words, it's going to be able to collect the armaments from the various dissidents that are in place, and is going to be able to open a dialogue with the people of Eastern Ukraine. Because I think part of the agreement calls for a national dialogue, and the Ukrainians themselves had made reference to the possibility of a national referendum on the issue of autonomy, etc. So the first process is obviously to implement the specifics of the agreement, the disbandment of illegal groups, of collecting of armaments, and the second process, obviously, should be running parallel with that, is to open that national dialogue, the political dialogue, both within the parliament in terms of getting the constitutional reform, as well as between Kiev and the powers that be in the eastern part of the country.
Ambassador Courtney, what are we to make of the fact that there is now a self-appointed government in Kiev? There are presidential elections, which are slated for next month, and there will be national elections at some point. But at the moment, it's a self-appointed government. A democratically elected government was overthrown in this process.
Well, what happened was a popular uprising occurred because of the massive corruption of the previous government, the lack of economic reform, the poverty, and then the decision by former President Yanukovych to turn to Russia rather than to turn to Europe. So all those things came together. A genuine popular uprising occurred. The current government, if you will, is temporary, it's tentative, and it's overrepresented by people from the western and central parts of Ukraine. Presidential elections should help cure that because it'll be a countrywide election, and then subsequent parliamentary elections really need to be advanced sooner so that people from all parts of Ukraine can elect their government.
But I'm just wondering, when we look at the example of Ukraine, whether that sets a bad precedent, sends a wrong signal to perhaps other countries around the world, where, as you say, a popular uprising changed the government when it actually should be done through the ballot box.
Well, sometimes popular uprisings, really play a greater role in ensuring democratic government in the future. We had our own popular uprising in the United States at one point. It's important for government to be accountable to the people, to be responsive to the people, and this is the kind of democratic government that Ukraine needs. What makes it harder for Ukraine now is it has to undertake economic reforms that have been postponed for 2 decades, leaving Ukraine much poorer than Russia, for example. So a more inclusive government that's broadly based will have the legitimacy, only that will have the legitimacy to undertake the economic reforms that Ukraine needs.
Ambassador Popadiuk, this agreement might get Vladimir Putin off the hook for now, insofar as further sanctions are concerned, but does it also get President Obama off the hook? Because we haven't seen a great deal of unity insofar as sanctions are concerned between the United States and Europe. Europe looks at it in a very different way.
Well, absolutely. I think it takes a lot of pressure off the administration in the sense of moving toward further sanctions or heating up the war of words between the two countries. It also gives the United States an opportunity to point to some kind of victory in terms or positive developments in terms of this situation. So it does take the president off the hook. It does take the administration off the hook. It also, well, the president could also make the argument that his position was the right way of going because, look, we've got this agreement now. But the devil is in the details, as they like to say. How this thing is going to be implemented is going to be important to see how it works out. I'd like to just add something to, your previous question, if you don't mind at this point. You talk about democratically elected government. Yes, Yanukovych had been democratically elected, but a point to be made here is there was a unity government. There was an agreement that was reached that could have led the country forward. But it was Yanukovych that fled the country and then led to this great debacle, so to speak, afterwards, because he fled the country within 24 hours, I think it was, and as a result, that left control in the hands of Parliament.
Would it help at this stage, do you think, to show good faith, to send a powerful signal to both sides in this conflict and to the rest of the world, for that matter, if President Obama met with Vladimir Putin?
I don't know what that would result in the sense.
Well, it's symbolic. It sends a message.
It's symbolic, but in many cases, you want your heads of states to come together and have good discussions where something results. Just having a meeting for the sake of a meeting doesn't necessarily lead to any kind of agreement or any kind of lessening of tensions. I think, in my opinion, right now, the way the process is evolving is going in the right direction. They've got a tentative agreement. The issue is to try to implement it. I think it's important for both sides to implement it. I don't think this is a time for theatrics, for leaders to get together without any substance behind it.
Right. Talking about theatrics, Ambassador Courtney, this hotel where the agreement was signed today was exactly the same hotel where Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, pushed the reset button with Russia. Was that a mistake?
No, actually, the reset accomplished quite a few things, including a strategic arms agreement and facilitation of NATO logistical support for NATO troops in Afghanistan, going through Russia on trains primarily. And there were some other aspects. We have a number of relations with Russia. For example, Russia launches U.S. astronauts to the International Space Station. There's cooperation in public health, a number of other areas. So we can't throw everything overboard, but we do need to sanction Russia. And there is still the issue, even if Eastern Ukraine is solved, there's still the issue of the illegal military occupation by Russia of Crimea. And as long as that persists, the sanctions ought not stay right where they are. The sanctions ought to keep increasing.
Ambassador Popadiuk, do you realistically expect that Russia will withdraw from Crimea?
No, I don't think, I don't foresee that in the near future at all, or in the long term. But as I was telling Bill earlier, there could come a position where Ukraine has become so successful that the people of Crimea will want to go back.
You know, I saw something in the Financial Times, and this was by a columnist in the Financial Times, and he said there was much public sentiment, particularly in Europe, talking about the situation, which runs from indifference to a sense that Mr. Putin may have a point and that he has won the propaganda war here. Ambassador Courtney?
What's particularly interesting about the propaganda war is that most of the Russian propaganda has been oriented toward Russians themselves. But as we saw in Donetsk I think today, we're seeing the Russian security forces and Russian militants, they've asked that Jews register with local authorities, or otherwise they could risk being deported. Well, if anything is Nazi-like, it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, I should add, though, that the person to whom that action was attributed has denied that he did anything like that. So, Ambassador Popadiuk, you're going to have the last word. Where do you see this go from here?
Well, I see a process of long-term negotiations taking place here, quite frankly. I hope there's enough of stability that the presidential election can take place on May 25th and take place successfully. The Ukrainian government itself has mentioned the need for decentralization. So the Ukrainians are ready to decentralize, in other words, having governors elected rather than being appointed by the president. The question is going to be at what stage does that end, and to what degree the Russians are willing to terminate the process and not push too much for federalization.
Okay, Ambassador Popadiuk, Ambassador Courtney, thanks for joining us.